Millionaire gave his unlimited credit card to a McDonald's employee. Hours later, he broke down in tears looking at his phone notifications. He simply couldn't believe what she spent the money on. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The autumn rain painted Liverpool's streets with a glossy sheen as William Harrison stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. At 55, he had everything money could buy, yet the reflection staring back at him from the glass seemed hollow, a mere shadow of the man he once dreamed of becoming. His salt-and-pepper hair was perfectly styled, his bespoke suit immaculate, but his eyes told a different story, one of loneliness and unfulfilled dreams. The Liverpool Echo lay open on his mahogany desk, its headline announcing another record-breaking year for Harrison Enterprises. 25 years of relentless work had transformed his father's modest company into a real estate empire spanning across the United Kingdom. Yet as he stood there watching the city buzz beneath him, William felt disconnected from it all. "Mr. Harrison?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. He adjusted his tie, more out of habit than necessity. "Cancel it, Margaret. Cancel everything for today." "Sir?" The surprise in her voice was evident. In 15 years, William Harrison had never cancelled a board meeting. "You heard me correctly. I need some time to think." The idea had come to him that morning while watching a documentary about social experiments. What if he, a man who had everything, could see how someone with nothing would handle unlimited resources? It wasn't about charity. He already donated millions each year. No, this was about understanding something deeper about human nature. William grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator. The security guard barely contained his surprise at seeing the CEO leave before noon. Outside, the rain had subsided, leaving behind that distinct petrichor scent that reminded him of simpler times. His driver waited by the Bentley, but William waved him off. Instead, he walked, letting his feet carry him through the city centre. He passed boutiques where a single shirt cost more than some people's monthly wage, art galleries showcasing pieces worth millions, and finally found himself in front of a McDonald's. Through the window, he watched the mundane ballet of everyday life. Teenagers laughing over French fries, business people grabbing quick lunches, and workers efficiently managing the constant flow of customers. One worker in particular caught his attention. A young woman with auburn hair tied back in a neat ponytail, probably in her early 20s, handled the lunch rush with remarkable grace. Despite the pressure, she smiled genuinely at each customer, even those who seemed less than pleasant. Something about her reminded him of someone from his past, but he couldn't quite place it. The thought slipped away as he watched her help an elderly woman find a seat and bring her order to the table, something that wasn't part of her job description. William entered the restaurant, joining the queue. When he reached the counter, the young woman, Sarah, according to her name tag, greeted him with the same warm smile she'd given everyone else. "Welcome to McDonald's, sir. What can I get for you today?" Her voice carried a slight Liverpudlian accent, softened by what seemed like years of professional customer service. William ordered a coffee, black, and while she prepared it, he made his decision. "Sarah, is it?" he asked when she returned with his coffee. "I have an unusual proposition for you." She looked at him cautiously, maintaining her professional smile but with a hint of wariness in her eyes. "Smart girl," he thought. "I'm William Harrison," he continued, noting no recognition in her eyes at the mention of his name. "And I want to conduct an experiment. I'd like to give you my credit card, unlimited credit, for 24 hours. Sarah's smile faltered for a moment as she processed his words. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think—" "No strings attached," he interrupted, pulling out a business card and his black American Express card. "Call my office, verify who I am. The only condition is that you document how you spend the money. You can use it for anything legal starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Her colleagues had noticed the conversation, and her supervisor was approaching. William placed both cards on the counter. "Think about it. Call my office if you're interested. If not, no harm done." He left his coffee untouched on the counter, turning and walking out before she could respond. As he stepped back into the grey Liverpool afternoon, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. Whether she took him up on his offer or not, for the first time in decades he'd done something completely unexpected. What he couldn't know was that his impulsive decision would set in motion events that would unravel the carefully constructed fabric of his life, bringing to light long-buried secrets and forcing him to confront the consequences of choices made decades ago. As he walked back to his office, Sarah Collins stood at the counter, holding his business card with trembling hands, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes as memories of her mother's old photographs flashed through her mind. Sarah Collins's hands trembled as she closed the door to her modest flat in the outskirts of Liverpool. The business card of William Harrison felt heavy in her pocket, like a stone weighing down her thoughts. She could hear her mother, Margaret, moving about in the kitchen, humming softly despite the constant wheezing in her breath, a reminder of the respiratory condition that had been plaguing her for months. "Mum," Sarah called out, her voice barely steady. "Are you supposed to be up?" Margaret appeared in the doorway, her once black hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still holding that determined spark that had sustained them through years of hardship. "I'm not an invalid, love. Just making some tea. How was work?" Sarah sank into their worn sofa, her McDonald's uniform still smelling of French fries and coffee. The Harrison business card burned in her pocket, but she couldn't bring herself to mention it. Not yet. Instead, she watched her mother, noting how she leaned against the doorframe for support, trying to hide her fatigue. "Something happened today," Sarah began, carefully choosing her words. "A man came into the restaurant. A businessman." Margaret set down the tea mug she was holding, her movements deliberately slow. "Oh?" "He made an unusual offer." Sarah pulled out the business card, holding it up without showing the name. "He wants to give me his credit card for 24 hours. Unlimited spending. That sounds dangerous, love. Some rich man giving his credit card to a young woman he's never met. There must be a catch." Margaret's voice carried an edge of worry, but something else too, a tension Sarah couldn't quite place. "I looked him up during my break," Sarah continued, watching her mother's face carefully. "He's legitimate. The CEO of Harrison Enterprises." She paused, noting how her mother's hands tightened around her mug. "The name Harrison, it reminded me of something." Margaret turned away, busying herself with wiping down the already clean counter. "It's a common enough name." "Mum." Sarah stood, crossing the small kitchen in 3 steps. "Those old photos you keep in the wooden box under your bed, the ones you think I've never seen, they're from when you worked as a housekeeper for a family called Harrison, aren't they?" The sound of Margaret's sharp intake of breath seemed to echo in the small kitchen. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, a bus rumbled past their building, its headlights briefly illuminating the worn wallpaper and second-hand furniture that had been their world for the past 20 years. "That was a different life," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A different time." Sarah pulled out her phone, displaying a photo she'd found online of William Harrison at a charity gala. "He looks exactly like the man in your photos. The ones you tried to hide. And..." She hesitated, her heart pounding. "He looks like the face I see in the mirror every morning." Margaret's mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the linoleum floor. Tea spread across the tiles like a growing stain, but neither woman moved to clean it up. "You were so young then, working in that grand house," Sarah continued, her voice gentle. "The dates match up, don't they? Your time there, when you left Liverpool suddenly, when I was born..." "Sarah, please," Margaret's voice cracked. "Some things are better left in the past." "But they're not in the past, are they? They're right here, right now. This man walked into McDonald's today and handed me his credit card. Of all the people in Liverpool, he chose me. That can't be coincidence." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, her face pale. "What are you going to do?" Sarah knelt beside her mother, taking her trembling hands. "First, I'm going to call his office and accept his offer. Then..." She squeezed her mother's hands gently. "I'm going to use his money to help people. And maybe, just maybe, find out the truth about who I am." "The truth isn't always kind, love," Margaret whispered, tears gleaming in her eyes. "I learned that the hard way." Sarah stood, pulling her mother into a tight embrace. "Neither is hiding it. You've protected me my whole life, Mum. Let me do this, not just for me, but for both of us." Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table, the business card propped against an empty mug. The Harrison Enterprises logo gleamed under the fluorescent light, and beneath it, William Harrison's name seemed to taunt her with possibilities and dangers. She pulled out her mother's hidden box of photographs, spreading them across the table. A younger Margaret smiled up at her, standing in front of a magnificent manor house, and there in several photos was a younger William Harrison, his arm around her mother's waist, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the number on the business card. As it rang, she looked at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. The same strong jaw, the same determined set of the eyes that she saw in William Harrison's photos. Harrison Enterprises, how may I direct your call? Sarah took a deep breath, 20 years of questions burning in her throat. This is Sarah Collins. Mr. Harrison visited McDonald's today and made me an offer. Could you please tell him I accept? As she hung up the phone, Sarah glanced at the medicine bottles lined up on the counter, her mother's prescriptions that they could barely afford. Tomorrow she would have unlimited access to wealth. But more than that, she would have access to answers that had been hidden from her all her life. The morning sun had barely touched Liverpool's skyline when Sarah arrived at Harrison Enterprises headquarters. The glass and steel building towered above her, its windows reflecting the pink-streaked dawn sky. She clutched her worn leather bag, containing a carefully written list of everything she planned to accomplish in the next 24 hours. William Harrison's assistant, a perfectly groomed woman in her 50s, led her to a conference room where the businessman himself waited. He looked different in daylight, more human somehow, as he stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, turning to face her. "I must admit I wasn't entirely sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," she replied honestly, meeting his gaze. There was something both familiar and foreign in those eyes that might be her own. "But I believe everything happens for a reason." William raised an eyebrow at her cryptic response, but proceeded to explain the terms. The credit card was hers until 9 a.m. the following day. His only requirements were that she document her purchases and avoid anything illegal. As he slid the black American Express card across the polished conference table, Sarah noticed his hands, strong and assured, like her own. "May I ask you something?" she ventured, picking up the card. "Why did you choose me?" William paused, considering. "There was something about you. The way you helped that elderly woman, perhaps. Or maybe—" He trailed off, studying her face with a slight frown. "Have we met before?" "No," Sarah answered softly. "But sometimes people can be connected without ever having met." Before he could question her meaning, she turned and walked out, the weight of the credit card in her hand giving her strength. Her first stop was already planned. By mid-morning, Sarah stood in the cardiac ward of Royal Liverpool University Hospital. Dr. Patricia Chen, her mother's specialist, listened with increasing amazement as Sarah explained that she wanted to cover the costs of not just her mother's treatment, but also those of 5 other patients who couldn't afford their necessary procedures. "Miss Collins, this is extraordinary," Dr. Chen managed, looking at the approved payment forms. "These procedures will change lives." "That's the point," Sarah smiled, thinking of her mother's wheezing breath. "Could you ensure my mother doesn't know about this just yet? I'd like to tell her myself." Her next stop was Grace's Place, a struggling shelter for homeless women that she'd read about in the local paper. The director, Ellen Mackenzie, burst into tears when Sarah handed her a cashier's check that would keep the shelter running for the next 2 years. "But why?" Ellen asked, wiping her eyes. "Why us?" Sarah thought of the stories her mother had told her about the months after leaving the Harrison mansion, when they'd relied on the kindness of strangers. Because everyone deserves a safe place to rebuild their life. Throughout the day, she moved methodically through Liverpool, her actions calculated yet heartfelt. She purchased supplies for 3 underfunded primary schools, paid for a year's worth of veterinary care at the local animal shelter, and set up a fund for university scholarships for single parents. By late afternoon, news of her actions had begun to spread. A local reporter caught up with her outside a soup kitchen, where she'd just arranged for daily fresh food deliveries for the next year. "Miss, are you the woman they're calling Liverpool's mystery angel?" the reporter asked, phone recording. "The one going around the city helping people with a black American Express card?" Sarah smiled but shook her head. "I'm just someone trying to make a difference while I have the chance." As the sun began to set, she found herself standing outside an old Victorian building on the outskirts of the city. The former Riverside Inn had been abandoned for years, its once grand facade now weathered and neglected. But Sarah saw beyond the peeling paint and broken windows. She saw possibility. The real estate agent couldn't believe his luck when she offered to buy the property outright, no inspection needed. As she signed the paperwork, Sarah's hand trembled slightly. This would be her largest purchase, her legacy. "What are your plans for the property?" the agent asked as he handed her the keys. "A place of new beginnings," she replied, looking up at the building's facade. "A community center where people can find help, hope, and healing." Back in his office, William Harrison watched the evening news with growing fascination. Every report showed another act of kindness, another life changed. But it was the grainy footage of Sarah outside the soup kitchen that made him pause the broadcast. Something in her gesture as she tucked her hair behind her ear, the determined set of her jaw, it stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He picked up an old photograph from his desk drawer, one he hadn't looked at in years. In it, a young woman stood in the gardens of Harrison Manor, her hair catching the summer light, her smile bright and full of promise. William's phone buzzed with a message from his mother, Victoria Harrison. "Have you seen the news? That girl. There's something about her that reminds me of..." He didn't finish reading the message. Instead, he found himself opening his laptop, searching for more information about Sarah Collins. Who was this young woman who, given access to unlimited wealth, had chosen to change lives rather than enrich herself? And why did he feel like he was looking at a ghost from his past? Victoria Harrison sat in her drawing room at Harrison Manor, her afternoon tea growing cold, as she watched the BBC News coverage. The reporter stood outside Grace's Place Women's Shelter, interviewing residents whose lives had been transformed by the mysterious benefactor with the black credit card. "She just walked in here like an angel," one woman said, clutching her baby close. "Paid for new beds, supplies, everything. Said everyone deserves a fresh start." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through the photos her social secretary had gathered of Sarah Collins. Each image seemed to pierce through decades of carefully maintained denial. The girl's features, her mannerisms, even the way she carried herself, it was like seeing a ghost of her past. The intercom buzzed. "Madam, Mr. William is here to see you." Victoria straightened her posture, smoothing her silver hair. "Send him in." William entered the room looking more disheveled than she'd seen him in years. His tie was loosened, and he carried a manila folder under his arm. "Mother, we need to talk about Sarah Collins." "Do we?" Victoria's voice remained carefully neutral, though her heart raced. "She's just some girl you gave your credit card to, isn't she?" "Is she?" William spread photographs across the antique coffee table, recent images of Sarah mixed with old photographs from 20 years ago. "Look at her, Mother. Really look at her. She has Margaret's smile. And my..." "Stop." Victoria stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the manor's gardens bloomed with late autumn roses, their beauty masking the thorns beneath. "Whatever you're thinking, William, let it go. The past should stay in the past, like we let Margaret go." William's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard since that tumultuous summer 20 years ago. "When she needed us most." Meanwhile, across the city, Sarah sat in a small cafe, reviewing her purchases from the day. The elderly owner, Mrs. Chen, had just served her a cup of chamomile tea, refusing payment. "You bought new equipment for my grandson's school today," Mrs. Chen explained, patting Sarah's hand. "The least I can do is offer you tea." Sarah smiled, touched by the gesture. Her phone buzzed continuously with notifications, journalists seeking interviews, people requesting help, social media exploding with stories of her generosity. But her focus remained on the task at hand. She pulled out her mother's old journal, found hidden in the same box as the photographs. The entries painted a picture of a love story that had bloomed in the very gardens she could see in those faded images. A young housekeeper and the heir to the Harrison fortune, sharing dreams under summer stars. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a distinguished elderly woman entering, her expensive coat and perfect posture marking her as someone from a different world. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. She'd seen that face in the old photographs, though now lined with age. Victoria Harrison stood frozen in the doorway, her carefully planned confrontation dying on her lips as she took in the young woman before her. In the afternoon light, the resemblance was undeniable. "Mrs. Harrison," Sarah said softly, rising from her seat. "I wondered if you might come. How did you know who I am?" Victoria's voice wavered slightly. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age, showing a younger Victoria Harrison in these same gardens, her arm around a laughing Margaret. "My mother kept this. Said you were kind to her before everything fell apart," Victoria finished, sinking into the chair opposite Sarah. Mrs. Chen quietly placed a fresh pot of tea between them, then retreated to give them privacy. "Did you know?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but firm. "When you sent her away, did you know she was carrying your grandchild?" Victoria's hands shook as she poured tea into delicate cups. "We all made mistakes back then. Terrible, unforgivable mistakes." She looked up at Sarah, tears gleaming in her eyes. "When I saw what you've been doing with William's card, helping people, changing lives, I knew. You're so much like him at your age, before he let bitterness change him." "I'm not doing this for revenge or recognition," Sarah said, pushing a folder across the table. "This is my plan for the old Riverside Inn, a community center, offering shelter, job training, childcare, everything my mother needed when she left Harrison Manor 20 years ago." Victoria opened the folder, scanning the detailed proposals Sarah had drawn up. "You've thought this through. I've had 20 years to think about what makes a difference in people's lives." Sarah's voice carried no bitterness, only determination. "The money's nice, but it's not about that. It's about making sure no one else has to choose between love and survival." Outside the cafe, reporters had begun to gather, word spreading that Victoria Harrison had been seen entering. But inside, time seemed suspended as grandmother and granddaughter shared their first cup of tea, 2 decades of silence breaking with each careful sip. In his office, William stared at his computer screen, watching the security camera feed from the cafe, a feed hastily accessed when his mother's driver reported her destination. He watched the 2 women talking, seeing the unmistakable Harrison profile mirrored in their faces. His phone rang, Margaret Collins' name flashing on the screen. After 20 years, she was finally calling back. William took a deep breath, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The experiment he'd started on a whim was revealing truths that had been buried for far too long, and there was no going back now. William Harrison's hands hovered over his phone, Margaret's name still flashing on the screen. Each ring echoed through his office like a heartbeat, marking the seconds before everything would change. Finally, he answered. Margaret. Her name felt both foreign and familiar on his tongue, like a long-forgotten melody suddenly remembered. "Hello, William." Her voice was softer than he remembered, worn by time and circumstance, but still carrying that gentle strength that had first drawn him to her. "I suppose we have quite a lot to talk about." In her small flat, Margaret Collins sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by old photographs and letters she'd kept hidden for 20 years. Her daughter's face smiled up at her from a newspaper clipping about the day's events, alongside a photograph of William from the business section. The resemblance was striking, undeniable. "Why didn't you tell me?" William's voice cracked slightly. "All those years ago, when you left, would it have made a difference?" Margaret's question hung in the air between them. "Your mother had made it clear that a housekeeper's child had no place in the Harrison family. And you were already engaged to Elizabeth." "I would have called off the engagement," William said firmly. "I would have chosen you. Perhaps. But at what cost?" Margaret's voice grew stronger. "Your mother threatened to destroy my reputation, to ensure I'd never work again in Liverpool. I had to think of my child's future." William sank into his chair, memories flooding back. The garden parties where their eyes would meet across carefully manicured lawns, the quiet evenings in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, the plans they'd whispered about running away together. "Sarah," he said the name softly. "She's remarkable, Margaret. Everything she's done today with the card, helping people, making a difference, she's everything we dreamed of being before life got in the way. She's your daughter, William." Margaret's words filled the silence between them. "She has your heart, your determination, and now she's using your own resources to create the change we once talked about making together." Outside William's office, Victoria Harrison stood listening, her hand pressed against the door. She'd rushed back from the cafe, determined to speak with her son, but now found herself frozen by the weight of 2 decades of secrets. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah stood in the empty shell of the Riverside Inn, surrounded by architects and contractors she'd hired. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating her vision for the space. "The East Wing will be emergency housing," she explained, pointing to her drafted plans. "The West Wing will house the job training facilities and childcare center. We'll need the renovation completed within 3 months." "That's an ambitious timeline, Miss Collins," one contractor said, scribbling notes. "We have people who need help now," Sarah replied firmly. "Every day we delay is another day someone struggles alone." Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "I'm talking to your father. It's time for the truth to come out." Sarah's hand trembled as she read the message, but her voice remained steady as she continued outlining her plans. The contractors exchanged glances, impressed by her composure and clear vision. Back in his office, William stood by the window, still on the phone with Margaret. "I want to meet her properly," he said, "not as some businessman conducting an experiment, but as her father," Margaret finished. "She knows, William. She's known since she saw you at McDonald's. Those old photographs I kept. She's been piecing it together her whole life." "Why did she agree to the credit card experiment?" William asked, realization dawning. "She could have exposed everything immediately." Margaret's soft laugh carried a hint of pride. "Because she's your daughter. She wanted to prove herself first, to show you who she is through her actions rather than her words." Victoria finally pushed open the office door, unable to remain silent any longer. William turned, phone still pressed to his ear, and saw his mother's tears. "Margaret," he said into the phone, "there's someone here who needs to speak with you." He held out the phone to his mother, whose hands shook as she took it. "Margaret, my dear," Victoria's voice quavered, "I've spent 20 years regretting what I did to you. Watching Sarah today, seeing the kindness and grace with which she's handled this wealth and power, I was wrong. So terribly wrong." As the sun began to set over Liverpool, casting long shadows across the city, 3 generations of secrets began to unravel. In the old Riverside Inn, Sarah reviewed construction plans, her grandfather's business acumen evident in every decision. In her flat, Margaret wiped away tears as she finally heard the apology she'd waited 20 years to receive. And in his office, William Harrison watched the evening news coverage of his daughter's actions, seeing in her everything he'd once hoped to be. The experiment wasn't over yet, but already it had accomplished something far more valuable than any lesson about wealth or privilege. It had begun to heal wounds that money could never touch, bringing together a family torn apart by pride and prejudice. The private dining room at the Athenaeum, Liverpool's most prestigious social club, had witnessed countless business deals and social arrangements over its century-long history. But tonight, as Sarah Collins stepped through its ornate doorway, the room would host a different kind of negotiation, one of the heart. William Harrison stood as she entered, his usual corporate confidence replaced by an almost boyish uncertainty. The table was set for 4, with fine china and crystal glasses catching the warm light from the chandeliers above. Sarah noticed his hands fidgeting with his tie, the same nervous gesture she often caught herself making. "You look just like your mother," he said softly, then corrected himself. "But you have my eyes. And your stubborn chin," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Mum always said that's what got me through the tough times." The door opened again as Margaret entered, escorted by Victoria. The years seemed to fall away as Margaret took in the familiar sight of William standing next to their daughter. Victoria, moving with careful dignity, completed the family circle. "Please, sit," William gestured, his voice carrying a tremor he couldn't quite hide. I thought we could have dinner as a family." As they settled into their seats, Sarah pulled out a leather portfolio. "Actually, I'd like to discuss something first." She opened it to reveal detailed plans for the Riverside Inn renovation. "Before this dinner turns personal, I want to ensure we're on the same page about what happens when your credit card experiment ends tomorrow morning." William leaned forward, intrigued. "You've certainly made headlines with your choices so far." "The headlines aren't what matter," Sarah replied, spreading out the architectural drawings. "What matters is creating lasting change. The Riverside Inn project isn't just about providing shelter. It's about breaking cycles of poverty and isolation. The same cycles Mum and I could have fallen into if she hadn't been so strong." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand under the table, squeezing it gently. Victoria studied the plans with growing interest, her business acumen recognizing the solid foundation of the proposal. "You've thought this through remarkably well," Victoria noted, examining the budget projections. "The operational model is sustainable." "I had 20 years to think about what makes the difference between surviving and thriving," Sarah explained. "While other girls dreamed of being princesses, I dreamed of building bridges, real ones between people who have and people who need." William sat back, studying his daughter's face. "And what role do you see for Harrison Enterprises in all this?" "That depends." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Are you asking as a businessman or as my father?" The question hung in the air as servers entered with the first course. For a moment, the only sounds were the gentle clink of fine china and the muted murmur of conversation from the main dining room beyond. "Both," William finally answered, "because I'm learning that perhaps they don't have to be separate things. Today, watching you use that credit card, you didn't just help people, you created a blueprint for how business could work differently." Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "You sound just like your father did at your age, Sarah. She paused, looking at Margaret. "Before I made him choose between his heart and his heritage." "Then let's not waste any more time," Sarah said, pulling out another document. "This is a proposal for a new division of Harrison Enterprises, the Harrison Foundation for Community Development. The Riverside Inn will be our pilot project, but I envision similar centers across the UK." William accepted the document, but his eyes never left his daughter's face. "You're proposing to revolutionize our entire corporate structure." "I'm proposing to fulfill the dream you and Mum had 20 years ago," Sarah corrected gently. "I found your old journals, Dad. Both of yours. You wanted to use the Harrison fortune to make real change in the world. Then life got complicated and that dream got lost." Margaret spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "We used to talk about it in the kitchen, remember, after everyone else had gone to bed. How wealth could be a tool for transformation, not just accumulation." "I remember," William whispered. "I remember everything." Victoria reached across the table, taking both Margaret's and Sarah's hands. "Then perhaps it's time we all remembered who we wanted to be, before society and status got in the way." As their main course arrived, the conversation shifted, becoming both more personal and more practical. They discussed childhood memories and corporate restructuring, shared dreams and sustainable funding models. Sarah's phone occasionally buzzed with updates from the contractors at Riverside Inn, each message carrying news of progress. "The credit card experiment ends tomorrow," William noted as dessert was served. "But this," he gestured to the plans spread across the table to the family gathered around it. "This is just beginning, isn't it?" Sarah smiled, and in that moment, everyone at the table saw the perfect blend of William's determination and Margaret's compassion. "Actually, Dad, I think this began 20 years ago. We're just finally getting back on track." Outside the private dining room, Liverpool's lights twinkled against the darkening sky. In the old Riverside Inn, workers continued their renovations through the night, their efforts illuminating the building like a beacon of hope. And in that elegant room at the Athenaeum, a family began the delicate work of building their own bridges, across time, across social divisions, and across the wounds of the past. Dawn broke over Liverpool as Sarah made her final purchases with William's credit card. The 24 hours were drawing to a close, but their impact would ripple far beyond this single day. Standing in the construction site of the Riverside Inn, she authorized the last payments for materials and labor, ensuring the project would continue uninterrupted. Her phone buzzed with a message from William. "Turn on BBC One. There's something you need to see." Inside the site manager's temporary office, Sarah found a small television. The screen showed William Harrison standing at a podium in the Harrison Enterprises headquarters, camera flashes illuminating his face as he addressed a crowd of reporters. "For too long, corporate success has been measured solely in profits," he was saying, his voice steady and clear. "Today, Harrison Enterprises announces a fundamental shift in our business model. 30% of our annual profits will now be directed to community development projects through our newly established Harrison Foundation for Community Development." The reporters erupted with questions, but William raised his hand for silence. "This decision was inspired by someone who showed me that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we share. Someone who, given access to unlimited resources, chose to change lives rather than enrich herself." The camera panned to show Margaret and Victoria seated in the front row, both women watching William with pride. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as her father continued. 20 years ago, I lost sight of what matters most. I let fear and social expectations drive away the people I loved most. Today that changes. He looked directly into the camera, and Sarah knew he was speaking to her. The Harrison Foundation will be led by Sarah Collins, whose vision and compassion have reminded us all of business's true potential for social change. The site manager's phone started ringing immediately. "Miss Collins, the press is gathering outside. They're requesting a statement." Sarah stepped out of the office to find a small crowd of journalists and photographers assembled near the Riverside Inn's entrance. Construction workers paused their tasks, watching as she approached the impromptu press gathering. "Miss Collins," called out a BBC reporter, "is it true that you're William Harrison's daughter? Was this whole credit card experiment a planned publicity stunt?" Sarah smiled, thinking of the scared young woman her mother had been, fleeing this very city with nothing but hope and determination. "This was never about publicity," she said clearly. "This was about proving that when given the opportunity, people can choose to use power and privilege to lift others up, rather than build walls between communities." She gestured to the building behind her. "The Riverside Inn will become a symbol of what's possible when business and social responsibility work together. But more than that, it represents a promise that no one in this city will ever have to choose between dignity and survival." Inside Harrison Enterprises, William watched his daughter's press conference on his office television, Margaret standing beside him. "She has your gift for speaking from the heart," he said softly. "And your gift for turning vision into reality," Margaret replied, squeezing his hand. "She's the best of both of us." Victoria entered the office carrying a dusty box. "I found these in the Manor's attic," she said, placing it on William's desk. "All the letters Margaret wrote to you after she left. The ones I never gave you." William stared at the box, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Dozens of unopened envelopes lay inside, each one a piece of the past they'd lost. "We can't change what happened," he said quietly, "but we can learn from it." Back at the Riverside Inn, Sarah was reviewing the latest architectural modifications when she received another message, this time from her mother. "Your father is reading my letters." "All of them." Victoria kept them all these years. Sarah leaned against a newly framed wall, feeling the weight of 2 decades of silence finally lifting. Through a gap in the construction barriers, she could see people gathering outside. Some were reporters, but others were local residents drawn by the news of what was happening in their neighborhood. A young woman approached her, pushing a stroller with one hand and clutching a newspaper in the other. "Is it true?" she asked. "This place is going to help single parents get back on their feet." "Yes," Sarah answered, kneeling down to smile at the baby. "Childcare, job training, temporary housing, everything I wish my mum had had access to when she was raising me." "I saw you on the news," the woman continued, "using that credit card to help people instead of buying luxury stuff. Made me think maybe there's still good people in the world, you know?" Sarah stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "There are good people everywhere," she said. "Sometimes they just need an opportunity to show it." As the sun climbed higher over Liverpool, Sarah's phone chimed with her final credit card alert. The 24 hours were officially over. But something far more valuable had been gained. A family reunited, a community renewed, and a future reimagined. In his office, William Harrison read through 20 years of letters, each one a piece of the puzzle that was his daughter's life. And in their small flat, Margaret Collins packed the last of their belongings, preparing to move into the apartment William had insisted they take in his building. The walls between their worlds were finally crumbling, replaced by bridges of understanding and forgiveness. The Harrison Foundation's inaugural board meeting was unlike any other in Liverpool's corporate history. In the newly renovated conference room of Harrison Enterprises, Sarah sat at the head of the table, her father William at her right, and her mother Margaret at her left. Victoria Harrison, watching from her seat nearby, couldn't help but marvel at how naturally her granddaughter commanded the room. "The Riverside Inn renovation is ahead of schedule," Sarah announced, clicking through her presentation. "But that's just the beginning. I've identified 5 other locations across Liverpool where similar centres could make a significant impact." The board members, a carefully selected mix of business leaders and community advocates, leaned forward, studying the projections on the screen. Among them sat Ellen Mackenzie from Grace's Place Women's Shelter and Dr. Patricia Chen from the hospital, both brought on for their frontline experience with community needs. The marketing team is calling it the Harrison approach, William added, pride evident in his voice. Using business acumen to drive social change. The Financial Times is running a feature next week. Sarah shook her head slightly. With respect, Dad, we need to be careful about the publicity. This isn't about building the Harrison brand. It's about building communities. Margaret touched her daughter's arm gently. Sometimes, love, a strong brand can open doors that need opening. Your father's name got attention, but your actions are what's inspiring people. Indeed, the impact of Sarah's 24 hours with the credit card had spread far beyond Liverpool. Other corporations had begun announcing their own social responsibility initiatives, though none quite matched the scale of the Harrison commitment. After the meeting, Sarah found herself in her father's office, now her office too, as they'd insisted on sharing the space. The view of Liverpool's skyline seemed different from this height, more like a canvas of possibility than a symbol of power. You know, William said, joining her at the window, I used to stand here and count my buildings. Now I look out there and count the lives we could change. Is that what you and Mum used to dream about? Sarah asked, turning to face him. Before everything fell apart. William's expression softened as he glanced at the framed photograph now sitting on his desk, a recent one of all four of them at the Riverside Inn construction site, hard hats on and genuine smiles brightening their faces. We had such plans, he admitted. Margaret understood people in a way I never did. She taught me to see beyond balance sheets, but I let fear cloud that vision. When your grandmother threatened to disinherit me, and now here we are, Sarah finished, doing exactly what you both dreamed of, with Gran as one of our strongest supporters. Victoria's transformation had indeed been remarkable. The society matriarch who had once driven Margaret away now spent her afternoons at the Riverside Inn, using her social connections to secure donations and support. She'd even converted part of Harrison Manor's grounds into an organic garden that would supply fresh produce to the Foundation's community kitchens. Margaret entered the office, carrying plans for the Children's Centre at Riverside Inn. The playground equipment arrives next week, she announced. And the job training program has its first 30 applicants. Sarah watched her parents exchange glances. Their love, buried for 20 years under social expectations and misunderstandings, was cautiously blooming again. They'd agreed to take things slowly, to build a friendship before exploring any deeper feelings, but anyone could see the spark remained. Did you ever imagine this? Sarah asked, gesturing to the three of them standing together in the CEO's office. When you were serving tea in Harrison Manor's kitchen, Mum, did you ever think we'd end up here? Margaret's eyes glistened. I imagined you would do great things. I just never dreamed we'd get to do them together. The intercom buzzed, interrupting the moment. Miss Collins, the press is here for your interview about the youth mentorship program. Actually, Sarah replied, looking at her parents, could you send them up? I think it's time we did this interview as a family. As the elevator carried the journalists up to their floor, William straightened his tie, a gesture Sarah now recognized as hereditary. Margaret smoothed her skirt, and Victoria arrived just in time, having been summoned from her garden project. Remember, Sarah said quietly as footsteps approached, we're not just telling our story. We're telling the story of every family separated by pride, every person who needs a second chance, every dream that got deferred but never died. The reporters entered to find 4 generations of Harrisons standing together. Victoria, with her silver hair and renewed purpose, William and Margaret with their rekindled connection, and Sarah, the bridge between past and future, ready to share their vision for a different kind of corporate legacy. Outside, the sun broke through Liverpool's clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. At the Riverside Inn, construction continued apace, each nail and beam bringing them closer to realizing a 20-year-old dream. And in boardrooms across the city, other business leaders began to ask themselves a simple but profound question. What if success was measured not in pounds, but in lives transformed? The credit card experiment had ended, but its ripples continued to spread, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined when a lonely millionaire walked into a McDonald's on an autumn morning. The morning of the Riverside Inn's grand opening dawned crisp and clear, a rarity for Liverpool in late autumn. The renovated Victorian building gleamed in the early sunlight, its restored facade a perfect blend of historical grandeur and modern purpose. The inscription above the entrance read, "Riverside Community Centre, where hope finds home." Sarah stood in the courtyard, surrounded by her growing family, taking in the transformation. Gone were the broken windows and peeling paint. In their place stood a beacon of possibility. Solar panels glinted on the roof, a state-of-the-art playground filled the eastern garden, and the community kitchen's herbs grew in carefully tended boxes along the walkways. "The first residents arrived today," Margaret said softly, adjusting the ribbon that would soon be cut. 5 families, all single parents. William squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "Are you nervous?" "No," Sarah replied, watching as the staff, all locally hired and trained, made final preparations. "This feels right. Like everything in my life has been leading to this moment." Victoria arrived, carrying a leather-bound book. "I found something you should have," she said, handing it to Sarah. "It's the original deed to this building from 1890. The first owner created it as a haven for merchant sailors' families, somehow fitting that it's returning to its roots of helping people." The gathering crowd reflected the project's unprecedented nature. Community members stood alongside corporate executives, social workers next to society figures, all united by curiosity about this new model of social change. News crews set up their equipment, preparing to broadcast the opening across the UK. "Miss Collins," a young woman approached, pushing a stroller. Sarah recognized her from their conversation weeks ago during construction. "I just wanted to say, I got accepted into the job training program, and my little one has a spot in the daycare center." Sarah hugged her impulsively. "What's your name?" "Jenny," the woman replied, wiping happy tears. "Jenny Parker. And this is Rose." "Welcome home, Jenny and Rose," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of personal understanding. "My mum and I were just like you once, looking for a chance to build a better life." As the ceremony's start time approached, the courtyard filled to capacity. William stepped up to the podium first, his corporate polish softened by genuine emotion. 20 years ago, I lost sight of what matters most," he began, looking at Margaret. "I chose status over love, security over courage. But life has a way of offering second chances, if we're brave enough to take them." He gestured to Sarah. "My daughter taught me that lesson when she used my credit card not for personal gain, but to lift others up. Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening doors to possibility, windows to opportunity, and hearts to understanding." Sarah took her place at the podium next, her presence commanding yet approachable. "The Riverside Centre exists because of a simple truth. Everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story. Every parent struggling to make ends meet, every person fighting to overcome circumstances, every dream deferred but not forgotten. This place is for you." She outlined the centre's features: temporary housing for families in transition, comprehensive childcare, job training facilities, mental health services, and a community kitchen that would serve 3 meals a day. But it was her next announcement that caused a stir. "Today we're not just opening one centre," she revealed. "Harrison Enterprises is committed to opening 5 more across Liverpool in the next 3 years. The Riverside model will be replicated, adapted to each community's needs, and we're creating a blueprint for other cities to follow." Victoria stepped forward with the ribbon-cutting scissors, but instead of doing the honors herself, she handed them to Jenny Parker. "Would you do us the honor?" she asked. "You and little Rose represent exactly why this place exists." As Jenny cut the ribbon, cheers erupted from the crowd. The doors swung open, and people began flowing into the building, exclaiming over the bright, welcoming spaces, the modern facilities, and the overall sense of hope that seemed to radiate from every corner. Margaret found Sarah standing in the new library, running her fingers along the spines of books that would help residents study for qualifications or read to their children. "You've created something extraordinary here, love." "We all did," Sarah corrected, watching through the window as William showed Jenny the daycare centre, where Rose would spend her days. "It took all of us. Your courage, Dad's resources, Gran's connections, my vision. We're stronger together." In the community kitchen, Victoria was already organising the volunteer schedule, her society friends signing up alongside local residents. The barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable were dissolving in the face of shared purpose. As the day progressed, more families arrived with their belongings, ready to start their new chapters. Each was welcomed personally, shown to their temporary apartments, and introduced to the support team that would help them build their path forward. Standing in the courtyard as evening approached, Sarah watched the building come alive with light and activity. Through one window, she could see a job training class getting started. Through another, children played in the daycare center. The community kitchen buzzed with dinner preparations. "You know," William said, joining her, "when I gave you that credit card, I thought I was the one conducting an experiment. Turns out you were the one teaching the lesson." Sarah smiled, thinking of that morning in McDonald's that seemed so long ago now. Sometimes the best way to find yourself is to help others find their way first. Above them, the new sign glowed softly in the gathering dusk. Riverside Community Center, where hope finds home. It was more than just a slogan. It was a promise being kept, a dream being realized, and a family's legacy being redefined, one open door at a time. 3 months after the Riverside Center's opening, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the first quarterly impact report. The numbers told a story more powerful than she could have imagined. 37 families housed, 52 adults in job training programs, over 200 children benefiting from the daycare and after-school programs, and thousands of meals served in the community kitchen. But it was the personal stories that truly measured their success. Like Jenny Parker, who had just completed her accounting certification and accepted a junior position at Harrison Enterprises. Or elderly Mr. Thompson, who volunteered teaching gardening in the community plots and found a new sense of purpose after years of isolation. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, smiling as William entered, followed by Margaret. "Ready for the surprise?" William asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Sarah checked her watch. "The board meeting isn't until 3. "What surprise?" "Come with us," Margaret said, taking her daughter's hand. "There's something you need to see." They led her to the executive elevator, but instead of going down to the lobby, William inserted a special key and pressed the button for the roof. As the doors opened, Sarah gasped. The previously empty rooftop had been transformed into a beautiful garden terrace. Flowers bloomed in raised beds, comfortable seating areas dotted the space, and in the center stood a small table set for 4, complete with champagne and her favorite dessert from the cafe where she'd first met Victoria. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, taking in the scene. "Well," William began, "your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking. About time lost and time we still have." He took Margaret's hand, and Sarah noticed something glinting on her mother's finger, a delicate engagement ring. "We're getting married," Margaret announced, her face glowing. "A small ceremony, right here on this rooftop next month." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she hugged them both. "It's about time," she laughed through her tears. Victoria emerged from behind a flowering trellis, carrying a leather portfolio. "And that's not all," she said, handing the portfolio to Sarah. "Open it." Inside were the deed and papers for Harrison Manor. "I'm transferring the manor to the foundation," Victoria explained. "We're converting it into a second community center, focusing on education and arts programs for underserved youth. The gardens will become teaching spaces for sustainable agriculture." Sarah stared at her grandmother in amazement. "But the manor..." "It's been in the family for generations, and it still will be," Victoria smiled. "Just serving a greater purpose. Besides, I've grown rather fond of my apartment near the Riverside Center. Being close to the community, watching lives change, it suits me better than rattling around that big old house alone." They settled around the table, and William poured champagne. The Liverpool skyline stretched before them, the Riverside Center visible in the distance, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, accepting her glass, "about expanding the program. Not just the 5 new centers we planned, but creating a network across the UK. We've had inquiries from Manchester, London, Edinburgh." "Always thinking bigger," William chuckled. "Just like your old dad." "With your mother's heart," Margaret added softly. "Speaking of expansion," Victoria interjected, "tell them your other news, Sarah." Sarah blushed slightly. "Well, remember Thomas, the architect who worked on the Riverside renovation? We've been seeing each other. He's designed an amazing sustainable housing project we could implement at all our centers." "Ah, so that's why you've been staying late at the construction sites," William teased. As they celebrated and shared plans, the rooftop garden seemed to glow with possibility. Below, Liverpool hummed with activity. At the Riverside Centre, another job training class was graduating. In the community kitchen, volunteers prepared the evening meal. Children laughed in the playground while their parents attended classes or worked with career counselors. "You know what I love most?" Margaret mused, watching the city below. "It's how the ripples keep spreading. Every person we help goes on to help others. Every story of success inspires more stories." Sarah thought of Jenny Parker, now mentoring other single mothers in the program, of the corporate executives who'd visited Riverside and launched similar initiatives in their own companies, of the politicians who'd begun studying their model for social change. It all started with a credit card, William reflected. One impulsive decision that changed everything. "No," Sarah corrected gently. "It started 20 years ago with two people who dared to dream of making a difference." She looked at her parents. "The credit card just gave us a chance to finish what you began." Victoria raised her glass. "To new beginnings, and to the Harrison Collins legacy, not of wealth or status, but of hope and transformation." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the rooftop garden, Sarah looked at her family, whole and healing and growing in ways she'd never imagined possible. The experiment that had begun with a simple credit card had blossomed into something far more precious, a testament to the power of second chances, the strength of forgiveness, and the endless possibilities that open up when people choose love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over regret. In the distance, the lights of the Riverside Centre began to twinkle on, a beacon of possibility in the gathering dusk. Inside, dozens of stories were unfolding, lives being reshaped, dreams being rebuilt. And up on the rooftop garden, a family that had once been broken by pride and prejudice celebrated their own restoration and the joy of finding their true purpose together. The rooftop garden of Harrison Enterprises had been transformed into an enchanted space for William and Margaret's wedding. White roses and wild English flowers cascaded from every corner, their fragrance mingling with the crisp autumn air. Twinkling lights were strung overhead, waiting for dusk to transform the space into a starlit haven. Sarah stood helping her mother with the final touches of her wedding dress, an elegant but simple ivory gown that made Margaret look more radiant than ever. They were in William's office, temporarily converted into a bridal suite, with the Liverpool skyline as their backdrop. "Something old," Victoria said, entering with a velvet box. Inside lay a pearl necklace that made Margaret gasp in recognition. "The one I used to polish in the manor," she whispered. "I always thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." "It should have been yours 20 years ago," Victoria replied, fastening it around Margaret's neck. "Consider it a very belated wedding gift." Sarah adjusted her own bridesmaid's dress, a soft blue that matched the autumn sky. "Something borrowed," she added, pulling out a delicate silver bracelet. "Jenny Parker insisted you wear it. She said it brought her luck during her job interview." The mention of Jenny brought smiles to everyone's faces. The young single mother had become something of a symbol for the Riverside Centre's success, recently promoted to a full-time position at Harrison Enterprises and moving into her own apartment with little Rose. A knock at the door revealed William's assistant. "The guests are all seated and Mr. Harrison is asking if we are ready to begin." The guest list perfectly reflected the bridge they'd built between two worlds. Corporate executives sat alongside Riverside Centre residents. Society figures mingled with community volunteers. Even the staff from McDonald's, where it all began, had been invited, watching with wonder as their former colleague prepared to marry one of Liverpool's most prominent businessmen. The ceremony setup was uniquely their own. Instead of traditional rows of seats, they'd arranged comfortable conversation areas throughout the rooftop garden, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged connection. The aisle Margaret would walk down wound between these gathering spaces, symbolizing the path that had brought them all together. "Before we go up," Margaret said, holding her daughter's hand, "I want you to know something. Everything that happened, the hard years, the struggles, even the separation from your father, it all led to this moment. Not just this wedding, but everything you've created. You're the best of both of us, Sarah. You took our broken dreams and made them whole. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill. Mum, you'll ruin your makeup. Oh, let it run, Victoria said, surprising them both with her informality. Some moments are worth smudged mascara. The sun was beginning its descent as they made their way to the rooftop. William stood waiting beneath an arch of roses, looking both nervous and more content than anyone had ever seen him. When he caught sight of Margaret, his face transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to every eye. Sarah took her place beside her father, squeezing his hand as they watched Margaret approach. The string quartet played softly, but the real music was in the gentle murmur of the gathering. A community coming together to celebrate not just a marriage, but a monument to second chances. The ceremony itself was simple, but profound. William and Margaret had written their own vows, speaking of lost time and renewed hope, of love that survived decades of separation, and of the daughter who had brought them back together. 20 years ago, I let fear drive away the best part of my life, William said, his voice carrying across the hushed rooftop. But love found a way back, through our amazing daughter, and her determination to make the world better. Margaret, this time I promise to choose love over fear, courage over comfort, and us over everything else. Margaret's voice trembled as she responded. William, our love story took the longest intermission in history, but it gave us the most beautiful gift in Sarah. Now we get to write the next chapters together, not just for us, but for all the families who need a second chance. I promise to partner with you in this adventure, in business and in life, in dreams and in reality. As they exchanged rings, Sarah felt a hand slip into hers. It was Thomas, her architect boyfriend, who had quietly joined her. Below them, the lights of the Riverside Center glowed warmly in the gathering dusk. Through its windows, they could see the usual evening activities continuing, a reminder that while they celebrated, the work of changing lives went on. The reception that followed was a celebration not just of William and Margaret's union, but of everything the past months had brought. Jenny Parker gave a touching speech about how the Riverside Center had changed her life. Victoria announced the official opening date for the Harrison Manor Community Arts Center. Even the McDonald's manager spoke, joking about how a simple credit card experiment had led to all of this. As night fell and the rooftop twinkled with strings of lights, Sarah found herself at the edge of the garden, looking out over the city she'd grown to love in a whole new way. The Liverpool skyline was different now, not a collection of buildings, but a landscape of possibilities. Penny, for your thoughts? Thomas asked, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne. I was just thinking about how life comes full circle, she replied, accepting a glass. 20 years ago, Mum left this city with nothing but hope and a secret. Now look at all of this. They watched as William and Margaret shared their first dance, their faces glowing with joy. Victoria sat with Jenny Parker and little Rose, the social barriers that once seemed so insurmountable now completely forgotten. Around them, the future of Liverpool took shape in countless conversations between people from all walks of life. The experiment that began with a credit card had evolved into something far more valuable than money could ever buy, a template for social change, a model for corporate responsibility, and most importantly, a reminder that it's never too late for love to find its way home. 1 year to the day after William Harrison walked into McDonald's with an unusual proposition, the Harrison Collins family gathered in the main hall of the Riverside Center to celebrate its first anniversary. The space buzzed with energy as residents past and present, staff, volunteers, and community members filled the room. Sarah stood at the podium, her presence now seasoned with a year's worth of leadership and love. Beside her, William and Margaret sat hand in hand, their wedding rings catching the light. Victoria, looking years younger than she had just 12 months ago, beamed from her seat among the community kitchen volunteers she now considered family. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. This building was empty, its windows dark, its future uncertain. But more than that, many of us were empty too. We had walls between us that seemed insurmountable, gaps that appeared too wide to bridge. She gestured to the display behind her, showing photographs of the center's journey. Today, we celebrate not just bricks and mortar, but the invisible foundations we've built together. Over 300 families have found their path forward through these doors. 87% of our job training graduates are now employed. Our community kitchen has served more than 50,000 meals, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. Jenny Parker stood up, holding little Rose's hand. "I'll tell my part of the story," she said confidently. Now the manager of the center's financial literacy program, Jenny had become a symbol of the transformation possible when people were given the right support. "A year ago, I was afraid to dream. Today, I'm helping others learn to manage their money and build their futures." William took the podium next, his arm around Margaret. "What started with a credit card experiment has become a movement," he announced. "Today, I'm proud to share that the Harrison Foundation model is being implemented in 15 cities across the UK. But more importantly, over 50 corporations have joined our initiative, committing portions of their profits to similar community development projects." Victoria stepped forward, her society friends now regular volunteers beside her. And Harrison Manor's transformation into an arts education centre has inspired 8 other historic estates to open their doors for community programs. Sometimes, old things must find new purpose. The celebrations continued throughout the day, with tours showcasing the centre's programs. The community kitchen served a feast prepared by its culinary training graduates. In the daycare centre, children performed a play they'd written about their community. The job training facilities hosted demonstrations of new skills learned, while the residential wing opened some apartments to show potential donors the dignity afforded to families in transition. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, Sarah found herself in her favourite spot, the centre's rooftop garden. Thomas joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea from the cafe where she'd first met her grandmother a year ago. "Your parents are looking for you," he said, handing her a cup. "Something about a surprise announcement?" Sarah smiled knowingly. She'd helped plan this surprise, after all. Below, the lights of Liverpool twinkled, including 5 new Riverside-inspired centres that had opened across the city. Harrison Enterprises' stock had actually risen since implementing their social responsibility program, proving that doing good could also be good business. "You know," Thomas said, taking her hand, "seeing all this makes me think about our own future. The sustainable housing project we've designed for the next centres, the community development plans we're working on together." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "It makes me think about building something permanent. Together." Sarah's eyes widened as he dropped to one knee, holding out a simple but elegant ring. Before she could respond, a delighted squeal came from the doorway. Margaret had found them, William and Victoria right behind her. "Perfect timing," Sarah laughed, tears of joy in her eyes. "Yes, Thomas. Yes to building everything together." As her family rushed forward to embrace them, Sarah caught sight of a familiar face in the garden below. Jenny Parker was leaving for the day, little Rose skipping beside her, both of them heading home to their new apartment near the centre. They represented everything the experiment had been about: lives transformed, hope restored, communities rebuilt. And to the power of one simple choice to change everything. "To love," Margaret added, "which always finds its way home." "To the future," Victoria chimed in, "which is brighter when we build it together." Sarah looked at her family, her parents, happily remarried and running the foundation together, her grandmother, who had traded social status for social impact, her new fiancé, who shared her vision for sustainable community development, and the extended family they'd built through the centre. William raised his glass in a toast. To family, both blood and chosen, to second chances and new beginnings. The walls that had once divided them had become bridges, connecting not just their own broken pieces, but reaching out to lift others up as well. The credit card experiment that started it all had long since ended, but its effects continued to ripple outward, touching more lives every day. It had taught them all that true wealth wasn't measured in pounds or pence, but in the strength of connections forged, the depth of lives transformed, and the legacy of love passed forward. As night fell over Liverpool, the Riverside Centre glowed like a beacon, its lights a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with one simple act of trust. The Harrison Collins family had discovered that happiness multiplies when shared, that purpose grows when pursued together, and that love, patient, persistent, transformative love, could bridge any divide and heal any wound. The experiment was over, but the real story was just beginning.